Good evening, all. As you come in, you're going to see a poll pop up, just a quick couple question poll to fill out. And I'm going to wait just 30 seconds or so for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, we'll slowly get the ball rolling here. Thank you for joining this evening. My name is Tal Kitron with Applerouth Tutoring Services. I work as an SAT and ACT and sometimes LSAT and PSAT tutor, and also executive functioning coach. I've been with the company since 2013, and today we are here to talk about the digital SAT, which it's still the new SAT, but it's to the point now where it's been around for over a year. And we're just going to talk about content, strategies, and then leave some time for questions. So as we go today, if questions do occur to you, please do put them in the Q&A. Oh, the LSAT is just a law school exam, not relevant to today. But yeah, put them in the Q&A and I will definitely get to those at the end. My goal is to work through some strategy for verbal question types, some strategy for math. And then if we have questions about it or we want to clarify or try additional questions, we should have some time for that at the end. So again, here's our game plan today. We'll talk format, just 6 or 7 slides about what the SAT looks like. And then we're going to dive into question types and really techniques, strategies that you guys can use. So first, here's the scoring of the SAT. It's usually the first question I get is what's a good score or how's the SAT scored? The what's a good score question is impossible to answer because it depends on where you start and it depends on your goals. But the SAT is very much a test of effort and can be improved. You can boost your score through time and work. One of the big differences these days from the old SAT, what it was a few years ago, is not only is it a digital test, but it's also adaptive. So we're going to talk a bit about what that means. But what you're going to see is 2 verbal sections. The second one is adaptive, and then you'll see 2 math sections. And again, we'll talk more about what that means. Each of these is scored out of 800. So you can get up to 800 on verbal, up to an 800 score on math, and then that's 1600 is the perfect score. Every SAT is graded on a curve. So you're standardized with the other people who are taking that test on that day. So sometimes you can miss a couple questions and get an 800 perfect score. Other times 2 questions may cost 30 or 40 points. It just depends on that test that day. This test is section adaptive, not question adaptive. What that means is you're going to see one module. So module 1 is always verbal, and we're going to look at some questions that you'll see. Depending on how you do, the second module will either be much easier or quite a bit harder. So that's significant, right? Everyone's going to see the first set form, right? Maybe questions in different order, but everyone sees a single form for module 1. But then for the adaptive section, it's going to be different. Everything's a bit harder if you get to the upper level. What that means is that you have to be strategic. Sometimes earlier questions on module 1 can affect your score more than later questions on module 2. And if you're finding on module 2 or 4 that everything's going pretty easily, you're like, oh, wow, this is a breeze. Section 1 was a bit hard, but this is easy. It's usually not a great sign. It probably means we're in the lower module. And if you are in the lower bracket, if you're in the lower adaptive module, you have a ceiling of like maybe a 600 out of 800. There's no way you can score much higher than that. Whereas if you get in the upper module, your floor is probably more like 600. So you can miss a bunch and still have a better score than someone who aced the second lower module. It's a bit confusing. This is one where when you take a practice test, you can really see, especially upon review. But just know that modules 2 and 4 ideally are going to be much more difficult if we reach the upper level module. Other things that my students often and parents often have questions about is just logistically, like how do we take this test? And so the number one thing that is not very intuitive and the College Board does not make it easy is you got to download what's called the Blue Book app. On test day, you'll actually bring in your computer, either school provided or your own laptop device with Blue Book installed. The week of the test, there's a process to click into the app and just hit a little button to register. And then the way it works is when you're in the test center, nothing else can run. You'll enter a code, you'll download the test, and it'll be unlocked. Right, so it's a lot more secure. The reason they're doing this is so there could be more school day testing. It's also just a shorter, crisper, more efficient test. What you can expect instead of a 3-hour plus exam is with regular time, it's a little bit over 2 hours. That includes breaks, one big 10-minute break in the middle. There's more time than there used to be to answer questions, so less of a speedy time crunch test. And we just refer to sections 1 and 2 as verbal now. It used to be reading and writing separately. And instead of testing about 13 or 14 grammar topics, there's only about 5. No more long passages. Used to be long passages with 10 questions apiece. Now it's short passages, 1 question apiece. And then we'll talk a lot about the graph and calculator option. Desmos is available on math, which is pretty amazing and very much changes the game on the math sections. So we'll look a lot at that and how to use it. So let's get into what the test itself looks like, and then we'll talk about some specific questions and question types. You can see here that each verbal module is 27 questions, and you get 32 minutes for that. Most people find module 1 to be not leisurely, but not a time crunch. But upper level module 2 can often be a big struggle for time. Just because the vocab is harder, the questions are longer, can be easy to get caught up. And then math, you have 22 questions and you have 35 minutes to do it. Within each section, there'll be some experimental questions, but we can't really prepare for that. So treat every question, as different and distinct and one you want to get right, because we don't know if they're going to throw any questions out. We don't know which ones they would be. They used to do like an experimental section 5, and they don't do that anymore. Instead, there's 4 sections, and within each section, there's some experimental questions. And then last little bit of just structure and kind of what this test looks like. You get on average a bit over a minute per verbal question. That's a lot longer than you get on the ACT, for example. And then same with math, you get on average like a minute and a half. So some questions will be very quick, super easy, 10 seconds. Others might take us a few minutes, but we want to average out to about a minute and a half. All right, so here's what we're here for, the content and the strategies. So let's start with just test tape strategies that'll work across the board. Number 1 is active reading, and it's a little bit different than it used to be. So active reading used to involve pencil in hand, really, marking up the test booklet, circling, starring, taking notes, underlining, and so on. As opposed to passive reading, which kind of starts here, right, and then here, and then there, and we're in trouble. Active reading now still may include some pencil work, like if you have scratch paper, which they should provide, but everything's on the computer. So the tools given are there's a highlighter. You can actually open a text box and annotate, although I haven't found many students who want to do that or find that helpful because the passages are short. And then again, on math, you've got other tools. I mean, the answer eliminator is helpful, but the calculator is golden, right? And the math reference sheet if you need formulas. So a lot of the strategies remain the same, right? Make sure you know what you're solving for and that you are actively engaging and not missing a word here or there. And then finally, don't leave anything blank just because, right? You can do it on a practice test if you know you want to come back and look at it after, but on the real test, leave nothing blank. My recommendation is pick your favorite answer choice of the day, whether it's A, B, C, or D. And for any questions you don't get to, bubble in that answer. We're more likely if you go A, to get some correct than if you go A, B, C, D, C, B, A. If you Christmas tree it, you'll probably end up missing them all. Statistically, if we go straight down the line, we'll probably get 1 or 2 out of 5. So let's talk about the verbal sections. We said 32 minutes, 27 questions. No more long passages with a bunch of questions attached. Each short passage will have just one question. And you can see on the left here some examples, like every verbal module, every SAT now will start with some vocab questions. And that looks like this. So here's our first practice question today. This is actually a grammar question. Oops, go back. Before you can definitely try to solve, but what you can see on this page is what you'll see on test day. And very important, I think, when you're practicing for the SAT, to download the Blue Book app on your computer and just work with it. You see the annotate button. That allows you to highlight or create a text box and type some things. This is just the time ticking down. You can hide it if it's distracting, but most people won't. This right here, and if my camera's in the way, I apologize, you can slide it. But the answer eliminator, I'd say incredibly important for verbal in particular. Mark for review for a question we take a lot of time on and we know we want to come back. You mark it, and then when you click down here, you'll see all the questions, including the ones you've marked. So once we get to the experts, you might be able to look at this question and say, well, oh, allow allows. This is probably a subject-verb agreement question. And so, if we really are experts, we know it's probably one of these, and C and D are wrong. Let's just look. The joining of plants' upper halves, called scions, to other plants' lower halves, called rootstocks. So our subject here is the joining, even though there's a bunch of plural nouns in here. The joining allows traits. So for this one, it'd be B. And your job, ideally, if I saw someone who got it down to those two choices, I already know we're doing well. And then if we miss it, we just need to tweak the subject-verb strategy, right? Hey, the subject was way before the verb. They're trying to trick us. Again, the only real way to get practice here is to download the Blue Book app, again, on the computer and just take tests. I'll talk to you about the resources that are available towards the end. So here's the first question type you will always see. And here is the strategy that I recommend. Step one is going to be ignore the choices. That's going to be counterintuitive, but for vocab questions, you're best off by predicting the word or phrase that you think will fit best. Then sometimes we have that down, right? We know it's this type of word, so then we just go back and eliminate answers. Sometimes we don't know what type of word. Still, I think the job would be go eliminate choices, don't work. And then finally, if you're left with a couple, you plug in, you analyze maybe the roots. Sometimes we have to guess if needed. What I would expect is if you want the upper level module 2, the vocab will just be quite a bit more advanced. So it's more common to not know what word we need or not know some of these vocab words. Then you focus on, as you read, focus on little clues. Frustrated with the something of existing terms. This person coined a new term. So probably frustrated with the weakness of existing terms or lack of, or something like that, something negative. So then I say, well, it's not going to be something positive like variety. I'd eliminate that. Precision is also positive. Down to these two, I don't really know obscurity, but limitations works well, so I'd be comfortable picking it. And the reason this doesn't work is because that means something that is not commonplace, right? A little bit odd or not commonly found is obscure. Again, some questions you're going to look at and be like, oh, I know the word. Many other times you'll be down to 2, and I think this elimination process will be the key. So that's vocab. You'll see some answers that are defining, or some words where you have the definition in place, some words where there are contrast words that give us clues, a lot of different things you can see on vocab. Then once you're through the first 4-ish questions, we get to questions like this, which are the longer ones. And so this strategy I'm going to write up really applies to the next few question types: command of evidence, inference, main structure, and purpose. Step 1 is going to be read the question. Right? What is our job? What are the writers asking us to do? In this case, which quotation from the spring most effectively illustrates the claim? Step 2 is read the passage, and we're going to need to now figure out, all right, what's the claim? The Spring is a 17th century poem by Thomas Carew. In the poem, the speaker compares the changes in the season to the attitude of his beloved. So all we've got is a comparison of season changes to someone's attitude. Then if you can predict the answer, great, but usually it's just going to be a process of elimination. And ultimately we want to find an answer choice that makes us say, I can't argue with that. Now this question is hard, 17th century, right? That's a big red flag right away. So we kind of have to just look at these choices and find the worst ones, like C doesn't really indicate they're talking about a person at all. And then same with A is closer, but the winter's gone, the earth hath lost her snow white robes. The her is describing earth, not a person. And so then going to be B versus D, right? And so like probably D only because it's talking about the sun, scalding noonday sun, so heat, and then ice. And then her heart and pity sounds like a person more than A did. But I would not expect many of my students to get this right. I would expect us to mark it for review, right? We hit that little button up top and then come back if we have time later. If not, you just pick an answer, you move on. But in this case, I do think D is the one they want us to pick. A lot of people can look at this and say, okay, well, I prefer vocab to command of evidence. Fair, but again, some of the tough vocab questions will be some of the hardest on the test. Next up is inference. Same strategy here. So we'll bring this back. It's really read the question, read the passage, eliminate choices, not rocket science. When you are inferring, you don't want to assume too much. I'll give just a minute for people to try this one. So here we've got which choice logically completes a text. That's classic inference. They mentioned polyurethanes, so if I was annotating, I'd write that. Commonplace, especially in seat cushions and furniture. They're durable in a variety of conditions. They're versatile. And then connector words are very important. They're difficult to recycle. They can contain harmful chemicals. So these people have been researching an alternative. Initial tests have been positive, and there's a new process for recycling. So recycling, yay. So the question is, well, are they going to be as good as polyurethanes in other ways? Are they durable? Are they versatile? And so that's why we're going to end up with B. But first, it's like, it's not A, because we're not talking about mass appeal. Not a terrible answer, but not A. It's not C because the paper pulp industry was just very much a minor thing mentioned. So I would not infer that we're mentioning that again. And also it's too future looking. And then comfort, well, they didn't talk about comfort at all. So if you really look at it, we'd want it to be comfortable, but they didn't mention it. So we go B. Again, these questions are, I think, simpler than they used to be on the SAT, but still some of the harder ones, just because there's a lot going on. It's easy to miss something or get confused or just lose focus. Then the final question type you're going to see, so this is, we're going to talk about grammar as well, but this is at the end of each module. So probably questions 25, 26, 27. And there's a very specific and important strategy for these, which is do not look at the bullet points unless you have to. So the strategy here is ignore the bullet points and keep your eye on the prize, which is we've got a job to do. The student wants to introduce the research of Aubrey and Schmidt. So let's start with that. This does, I can say without looking at the left side, does not mention the two people. So there's no way that introduces their research. B mentions them, C mentions them, D does not. And now we just need to look at this part, an audience already familiar with global warming. B says global warming continues to be a major concern and they're planning a strategy to combat it. Well, not terrible. I think that it's not very specific, so I'd maybe want a better answer. And then C, well, mitigate global warming, meaning make it better, really says what they're doing in their process. And so C is a much, much stronger answer. We never needed to look here. On the very hardest synthesis questions, you might. So if you're down to 2 answers you don't know, then look over here and you can evaluate that way. But again, these always come at the end. I'd encourage you to not do them last because they're very simple. So I would probably do the last 10-ish questions at some point in the middle of the section. It's just important to bounce around, make sure you get the easy points. And if you finish with not much time, you want to be time crunched on the hardest questions, not the easiest. So that's the benefit of jumping to the end of the section. And then from about question 16 to 25 on most modules, you will see grammar. One of the main things they will test is clauses and punctuation. So here's just a little breakdown of the rules that people can review. Let's see, use for a comma, periods and semicolons, much easier to test. And then the colon, which most students are just not comfortable with, and the test writers know that. So get comfortable with the colon as a drum roll. It has to have a full sentence before it, but anything can come after as long as you introduce. I had one great passion in life, drum roll please, what was it? Making pizzas, or eating pizzas. And these are question types that we can just really rapidly get better at. So for these questions, you actually want to start with the answer choices. So a new strategy tip for a question like this, anytime you've got grammar, start with the answers. It's very easy to determine what's being tested. Periods and semicolons should get tested first. Because for one thing, they're basically identical. On this test, periods and semicolons both have to start and end sentences with one exception. So I can look at A and B and say these are the same, they're both wrong. Because they can't both be right. We can't have 2 answers that are correct. So they're the same, they're both wrong. Then we look at C versus D to see if we can get away with no pause. But in this case, it says Beatrix Potter is perhaps best known for writing and illustrating children's books such as The Tale of Peter Rabbit, but she also dedicated herself to mycology, the study of fungi, producing more than 350 paintings. If you make that long pause and it sounds okay, then you know we need it. C would be way too much breathless going through without pausing. Grammar questions are probably the place to start on the verbal modules for SAT and PSAT prep, just because a lot of people are like really struggle with the rules. And once they've refreshed it and see the patterns, they can get these every time quickly and confidently. You will also see at least 3 or 4 connector questions per section. For these, you want to look, okay, so the answers clearly show, so straight to the choices. The answers clearly show we're testing connectors. So now just determine the logic of the sentence. Meaning, are we having contrasting ideas or similar ideas or something different? Organisms have evolved a number of surprising adaptations to ensure their survival in adverse conditions. Tadpole shrimp embryos, blank, can pause development for over 10 years during extended periods of drought. Well, that one's an example. So like there's no contrast, and then consequently means therefore, but there's no cause and effect. Right, so if you're not confident with what all the connector words mean, you review that, but it's really just going to be about what the logical flow and connection is. The last question type that we haven't talked about is also actually command of evidence. It falls under command of evidence if you ever need the category, but they just have graphs sometimes. What I do for these is question first, So I would start right here. Read that to determine what they're asking, right? So I guess we'll hear, right? Question, passage. So what weakens the conclusion? So I'll read this to find the conclusion. And then you can go through the answers and evaluate them as you go, right? So like A, at the very least, is true. The spider population count was the same in both enclosures. In this case, it seems like all the answers are true. B says it declined by day 30 in the enclosure without lizards. That is true. C, the largest decline in the enclosure with lizards occurred from day 1 to day 10. That also seems true. So in this case, we can't rule out anything. We would need to look at the actual logic, the conclusion. And in this case, probably that will lead us towards choice B. The conclusion here is as follows. Spider population went down in the enclosure with lizards entirely because of, it's entirely attributable to the lizards. So what would weaken that is the fact that the thing with no lizards also had a bunch of spiders die or disappear. This question is a little weird because usually we're trying to strengthen the conclusion, but if B is the way we read that graph, it certainly weakens the conclusion that the lizards are the only reason spiders are being reduced. Again, these are questions you may want to finish with just because they can take a long time. All the answers can look similar. So if you're tired or you're struggling for time, these can be trickier. But that's that for verbal. So again, I think we're about halfway through. Questions as they come up, please put them in the Q&A. I definitely want to make sure we talk about Desmos and some of the math stuff. So we're going to get to that first. This is a reference sheet that is always available. We talked about 35 minutes, 22 questions. On the top right, you'll see a little squiggly x squared, and that's how you can pull up all these formulas. So that's all the geometry formulas you may need. The old paper SAT was very verbal heavy, so even on math, you had a lot of word problems, and now we don't have that as much. I think they want a lot more foreign students with English as a second language to take it, right? So now the math is a lot more approachable for them. And again, don't forget these formulas are there. So part of it is just not, you don't have to memorize a special right triangle like 30, 60, 90, just to remember, oh, that's a thing, and I have it available if and when I need it, right? Same with Pythagoras or the volume of a sphere. Here's the breakdown, which we'll flesh out a bit more, but it's 70% algebra now. So you have to have taken algebra 2 for sure to really succeed on this test. And then if you have had pre-calc, that'll help on some of the hardest questions at the end. Reduction, the biggest reduction was in statistics and data analysis. And then there aren't that many geometry trig questions, but some of the hardest problems are usually those. Most of the questions are multiple choice, but about a quarter will be grid-ins for your response. That's not that different from old tests, except that you can grid in a negative number now. That didn't used to be the case. And you can grid in up to 5 digits or 6 with a negative. It used to be 4. Here are some acceptable and not acceptable answers, and this is also something that is provided on test day. We want to be familiar so you don't have to like waste time looking at it, but just notice that like 3.5, you can write as 3.5, 7/2, right? But not the mixed number, 3.5, that would not work. And be careful with rounding as well. Here's what the math looks like. So let's kind of take a quick inventory of everything we've got. Time up top, of course, we see that. Mark for review. This is a little bit less helpful, although sometimes can be useful on math. This is the absolute golden thing that we need. You can have your handheld calculator too, like a TI 83 or 84, any scientific calculator is pretty much allowed. But this is really the key to this test now. So I used to have to teach a lot of, like for this, let's figure out how to factor it. right? And let's really do the math. And for ACT, right, for those of you who are going to be here on Thursday, we still have to do that, right? For ACT, you don't have a graphing calculator. You have your own calculator, but you can't, it's not something you can just like pull up on test day and have it just like sitting right here to work out the problem. So a question like this now would be, all right, just understand this is a parabola. When we graph it in the calculator, which we're literally going to do on test day, it'll look something like that. And then our job is just to evaluate, and this will be a throwback to algebra for people, but we can just look at the zeros, you can click in on them, and based on those zeros, it'll tell you what the factored form will be, right? So like in this case, if it's at, not drawn to scale here, but if x equals -10 and x equals 5, then we want to be able to know, oh, that means x plus 10 and x minus 5, which is choice C. There are a bunch of ways to do this, right? You can FOIL, if you remember that, first, outer, inner, last, to see which matches. Also, to be perfectly honest, you can just graph this and then graph each answer to see which one looks identical. So it depends on what you feel is quickest and won't cause careless mistakes. But again, getting that practice with Blue Book is the #1 way to understand what's most efficient for you, what feels right. So here's what that looks like. If you've ever gone to, most of my students have used at some point, desmos.com/graphing calculator. This is what you pull up. You can expand it, you can close it, you can minimize it. And it's really, it does a ton. I mean, people don't even understand how much you can do on this. You can switch from radians to degrees. You can do mean and median and mode. Graphing stuff is probably the biggest thing. Sliders is something that people aren't familiar with and need to practice. So if some of that's unfamiliar to you, that's okay. We'll look at some of that now, but just really getting on Desmos and Blue Book and practicing, #1 key to success on the math portions. This is just recapping what I've been saying about this Desmos calculator. All you do is you click the button, it opens it up. You can slide it to the left if it's out in your way. You can make it larger if you need to zoom in and out, and so on. Systems of equations now are going to be done on Desmos. You just look at where they intersect and decide if we're solving for X or Y. That third module, so module 3, which is the first math section, probably 60% of the questions can be solved on Desmos if you understand what they're asking. Right, so this is a ticket to solving a lot of problems where some students are going to be sitting there doing math and thinking, man, I think I should know this. And others will be like, oh, right, Desmos. Boom, got it. The hardest questions will have extra layers. You won't be able to just graph them. But to start, you definitely need to just think about which ones can we throw in the graphing calculator. This is the breakdown of math topics and question types again. So just seeing that geometry and trig actually went up a bit and the stats went down, right? And much more algebra heavy these days. Overall strategy. #1, what am I solving for? So read the question, make sure you are solving for the correct thing. They will provide scratch paper, and it's probably good to write down what you're doing as well as annotating on screen. Once you know what you're solving for, think about, all right, what do I already know? And how am I going to use it? Right? Am I graphing? Am I going to plug in a point? Am I isolating? Then do the math. Don't skip steps, right? Show each piece of work still, writing it out on paper if needed. If it's just putting in the calculator and tracking that, that's fine, but be careful. And then when you're done, double check that you answered the question. Did you type everything into the calculator correctly? Right? If you rounded it, did you do that properly? Did we solve for X? And did they ask for X or Y? Right? Did I flip a positive, negative sign? We don't have a ton of time to check, but you always want to just do that logic check to see, does this make sense? I'll leave this on screen for a minute because I think it's helpful too. For each math question that's algebra, which again is like 70%, yes, you want to be thinking about Desmos, but maybe even before that, you should be thinking about your basic algebra tools. So these 5 steps are going to be the probably most common, definitely the most common. We may just be isolating a variable, right? Getting a by itself. Maybe we're adding or subtracting or combining like terms. Factoring and foiling is less common because of Desmos, but maybe we do that. Maybe it's just a matter of distributing to make two things look the same. And then substitution is probably the most popular thing, where you're plugging in a point or an X or a Y or what have you. If you hit a wall and you think, well, man, none of that's really working, I tried it, but I'm not getting anywhere, maybe the answer choices will help. You can plug them in. If the answer choices are not helpful, pick your own numbers. There'll be certain questions we'll see that that's the best strategy. And then absolutely do not forget about Desmos. Even if you don't know that that's your first step and you're not sure, it may save you on a question just by testing some things or even just double checking an answer. All right, let's do some practice questions. We're doing well on time, probably about 15-ish minutes of this, and then we'll open it up for questions. This is an inequalities question, which sometimes scares people. There are absolutely a ton of ways to do it, one of which would be graphing it. One of which is just plugging in the answers. So that's what they're getting at here. To be honest, the way I would solve this question is treat it like an equation. So subtract 2x on both sides. And then subtract 3 on both sides. And you get x is greater than or equal to -8. The only one of these that is not a solution to that would be -9, because that's less than -8. The other way you could look at this, or one other way, is if you plugged in a, you can tell it won't work, right? If you plug in -9 right there and there, you get -27 plus 3. But over here, you get -23. And if you think about that, this is not true, right? -24 is not bigger than -23. Whereas if you plugged in choice D, you would see that it works. So it's not our answer. You would get 12. 9 plus 3 is greater than or equal to 6 minus 5. Well, yeah, where I come from, 12 is definitely bigger than 1. And then there are ways that you could just graph this and just look and see, okay, well, which x value is in the shaded region and which one is not. But honestly, that's probably making it more difficult than it needs to be for a question like this. Here's an exponential modeling question. So this is a great one to see. We'll definitely see questions like this on the digital SAT. So here we're looking for which of these equations represents our modeled situation. You probably want to review exponential modeling, but our initial amount is always the first number. So like A and B just don't look right. A lot of people can get it down to these two. The 2 is a 200%, it's showing doubling. And then they're saying every 12 hours. So the way I would do this is, okay, in one day, T is 1, I would expect it to double twice. I plug it in here, well, that doesn't work. I don't actually get an exponent of 1 until I plug in 12. So C says the number of vitrions doubles once every 12 days. And then D, if I plug in T equals 1, this turns into 2, which means the number doubles twice in one day. And that is what we want. A lot of the modeling questions is about plugging in simple numbers like 0 and 1 to understand, just translate back to what they're saying. Here, if we get down to C and D, that's great, but then you really want to understand 2T means it's happening more often. T over 12 means it's happening less often. So D as in dog would be our answer for this one. Once every 12 hours would be twice every day. We're going to look at these content areas and then just some example problems and make sure that at least you have a baseline of comfortability for the main question types. Starting with basic algebra, which is mostly y equals mx plus b. So just equation of a line, slope, y-intercepts, and very, very heavy on the Desmos. Take a look at these two questions. Think about how you might solve on test day, and then I can help. The reality is for this first question on the left side, how many solutions means how many times does this line intersect with this line? So I would graph them. I would probably do the first expression by itself and the second expression, and then literally just see how many times do they intersect. If we just distributed here, 12x minus 21 equals 12x plus 20. These are two lines with the same slope. So those lines are going to be parallel, and they have different y-intercepts, so they're not the same line. They are never going to intersect. These lines will never, ever intersect. Mathematically, we could have continued here by subtracting 12x from both sides, because then you're left with minus 21 equals 20, which like, no, it doesn't. Right, because then you get 41 equals, or negative 41 equals 0, which makes no sense. Here, though, I think the easiest way to do it by far would be graphing it, and graphing it as two separate lines. Whereas for number 2 on the right-hand side, this looks like a modeling question. What's the best interpretation of y? Well, let's just plug in y is 0 and y is 1, and let's find out. So this is the number of devices. There's a 1,200 acre industrial area, so we're not talking about that. And an 1,800 acre residence area. If y is 0, then this becomes 18. This becomes 0. If y is 1, it's 1,800. And if y is 2, this is 3,600. So if we look at B versus D and think about which one makes more sense, total number would have to be y times 1,800. So that includes that coefficient. B, average number, makes more sense, right? So if the average is 1, then times 1,800 for each person. These questions are very hard for some people, others it just clicks. But if you plug in numbers to make it real, you can narrow it down very simply, and then usually pick between the two decent answers. Next, we've got Algebra 2, basically advanced math. So about 35%. These are going to be polynomials, pattern matching, but a lot of parabola stuff. So vertex form, square roots, quadratic formula on occasion. But a lot of stuff about x-intercepts and vertices. Here are 2 more questions for us to try. This one on the left, got to make sure you're solving for the right thing, but all the answers say 3k minus 2. So here you just take it step by step. Start by multiplying to get rid of the fraction. Don't try to do this all in one. That will cancel this part, right? So that goes away. And then all you have to do to get 3k minus 2 by itself is divide both sides by the 3n. So we'll get d. That's called applied algebra. They're just trying to make it look confusing, but there's not much going on there. And for number 2, we could graph it. It would be a downward opening parabola. You can also just think logically. the height in meters from which the ball was dropped. Well, how long has it been when the ball was dropped? 0. The way I would do this question is I would type in it as f of x equals -4. I would put this in Desmos on test day. Equals -4.9x squared minus 15x plus 600. And then if I really want to make my life easy, which I do, I would just say, okay, what's f of 0? So what's the height when the time is 0? And of course, it's going to be 600. Right? In this case, they're not asking us the maximum height, the vertex. That's different. They're asking you for the y-intercept, right? Our starting point. We can make that, though, incredibly simple with Desmos. Second to last category is stats. This can include mean, median, mode. It can include scatter plots, stuff like margin of error and box and whisker plots, but more commonly percentages, ratios, and probability. Here's a couple questions to look at. Just because we've got a few more I want to get to, I'll just kind of work through these together with you guys. This first one is just a proportions question, and not even that. 1,248,000 out of 1,600,000. They're just saying like this is what percent of that. So all you need to do is divide them, right? And then you'll get a decimal and you multiply it by 100. So literally just take this and divide it by the total. That's percentage in this instance. And then for number 2, we could type them both into Desmos. You type in mean parentheses and then just list these numbers with commas between them. But pretty obviously, I mean, the average of this data set will be lower. I mean, that's just it, right? It's got a 1, the other one doesn't. So that will drag it down. Outlier pieces of data always affect the mean more than the median. Outliers affect the mean more than the median. Again, this is probably the least important topic just because they don't test it as often as they used to. And then geometry and trigonometry. SOHCAHTOA, got to have that down. Pythagoras, basic geometry formulas like angles and triangles, and then making sure that you're drawing things out. That'll be the biggest thing for these questions. Here's a couple examples. The first one is Pythagorean theorem. And so there's actually a good way you could do Desmos on this, but you can just do 48 squared plus 52 squared, and then you're going to have to simplify the root to figure out what b is. We may have time to come back to this. For the second one, you got to know alternate interior, alternate exterior. So understanding that y equals z, but also that x plus z and x plus y would equal 180. Once you have that, you can pretty easily plug these in, solve for c, and then solve for z. And right away, these answers don't make a whole lot of sense because they are less than 90, whereas z is clearly an obtuse angle bigger than 90. So when I say double check that you're solving for the right thing and that you have an answer that makes sense, that's part of what I mean. So logic is always an undercurrent through this test. And then I just want to spend a few minutes before question time on showing you guys a little bit about Desmos. Again, the best practice is going in and doing it on your own. But like systems of equations. Back in the day, I would have said, all right, do we want to isolate and substitute? Or do we want to use elimination and get rid of one of them? But now we do this. And I think it's harder than ever for tutors and teachers of SAT stuff to not try to be gurus and say, you should do it this way. Here, let me show you. The better move during session time is I'll have my students share their screen. They'll punch this in on Desmos, get the muscle memory so they know what to do, and then click on whatever they need to solve for the right thing. In this case, we have the intersection point. We wanted the y value, so our answer is 3. Done. As long as you've typed it incorrectly, this is the easiest question in the world now, whereas some people who don't know they can use Desmos will be taking time and energy and maybe missing. Here's a quadratic question. This question is very clearly more difficult than the last one, right? It's algebra 2, not algebra 1. We're dealing with a parabola. It's not that easy to factor. So we're asked for the function has zeros, so x-intercepts at points A and B. What is the distance? Well, the easiest move is going to be graph it and just count, or just look. Here are your true zeros when you graph it, 3 and negative 3.5. Well, what's the distance between those? I just have to subtract the small one from the big one. 3 minus negative 3.5 is choice C, 6.5. Done. All right, we need to have questions like this so that we can take more time and energy on the hardest ones. Here's a functions question with 4 answers that just they're asking which of these has the proper points, the proper x, y points that go on this graph. You're probably going to sense where I'm headed here. We're just going to graph it. You can actually type a table in. I don't usually do that. So I might just type in the exponential equation and then just look at what points are on the graph. But again, there's just so many things that you can do to make your life easier on Desmos. Just got to get in there and practice. Here's a great one. A school administrator budgets $100,000 to purchase laptops and tablets. She must purchase a minimum of 150 tablets. Tablets cost $230, laptops cost $640. The question is about what is the maximum number of laptops the school administrator can purchase. Got to be an integer, a whole number. This question is probably the hardest we've seen because the setup is crucial. And then when you graph it, if you do set it up properly, it'll look like this. This part is the have to have a minimum of 150 tablets, and then this is the money bit, budget 100,000, and this is how much everything costs. Here, because you've got x is 150 and y is 102.344, notice what they are asking. Let me go back. What is the maximum number of laptops? So if it has to be an integer, it looks like the maximum is 102. The highest y value that would fit in our inequality is 102. That is your answer. Again, that question is tougher than most that we see. All right, recap, and then if there are some questions, we can get to those. Number 1, circle what you're solving for, answer what you're actually being asked for. Don't sleep on little details, right? Solve for x over y. People do that all the time. Don't leave anything blank, so always just bubble something in if you're rushed. Definitely strategically skip around, especially on module 2 of verbal and module 4 of math. And then just don't forget to use the tools available. The formulas, the Desmos, there's almost always some sort of simple method of solving. So that is the digital SAT. Applerouth has 3 pretty good tests that are quite tough, DS23A, B, and 24A. You can get a full score report from that. Blue Book, as I mentioned a bunch of times, also has great resources. There are 6 full digital SATs, which is where I would start. And then 2 or 3 digital PSATs, depending on which levels you do, but also available via the Blue Book app that you get on the computer. These are all fantastic resources. There are many others, but I would start with the Blue Book digital practice tests. All right, we got to the end. Thank you guys for joining. We've got 5 or so minutes at least for questions, and we're going to launch one more poll as I pull those questions up. And if you don't have any and you feel satisfied, hope it was helpful, feel free to take off. And thank you for joining. All right, a couple of good questions already. And the first one is, when using the calculator, are you able to copy those equations right in, or do you have to type it all out, including exponents? The answer is you have to type it out. You cannot copy paste on Blue Book. There are little shortcuts though. For example, if you do SQRT, that's a square root. If you do nth root on Desmos, that'll get you a little, you can do like the cube root. If you just want to do an exponent, you do shift 6, right, to an exponent. So there are shortcuts for almost everything, but you cannot copy paste. It's a good question. Would be nice if you could. Next question is, do you have any tips specifically for solving word problems? Because this person says they're not the best at looking at word problems, knowing what goes where. Yeah, I think a big part of it is going to be breaking it down step by step. But also, if you look, for example, at this one, you have to, I think, start with, all right, is there one equation? Do we have two equations? Is it linear? Is it exponential? Here, I'd be looking at the money part of it and then thinking about, okay, how many different things do I have? Right? So there's like the thing inequality, which is laptops plus tablets, usually. In this case, they only had a tablet inequality, which is right here. So just think each part minimum. So that means I have to be at least greater than or equal to 150. I think the biggest advice I have is break it down into steps and try to translate to numbers. But also because there are so few word problems now, feel free to skip past them, right? Mark it for review, come back, go get questions you feel better about that are more mathy. And if you run out of time on this, oh well, right? Not the end of the world. Yeah, good questions. Got a couple more minutes. I'll just see if anyone else has anything they want to talk through. And we'll be doing an ACT session on Thursday. So for those of you who join there, you'll see kind of how massively different these tests are now. Because ACT is more of a time crunch, all on paper test for now, whereas the SAT is a lot more of a common core kind of logical test throughout. All right, I think seeing no more questions, let's call it a day. You can definitely reach out to Applerouth with any that come up. Really appreciate you guys joining this evening and hope you learned a lot. Have a great rest of your night.